who's a co-founder of Mapping Prejudice. He's also a PhD student in the University of Minnesota's Department of Geography, Environment, and Society, and he's going to share a short overview of the history of racial covenants in Minneapolis. So with that, let's welcome Kevin.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I'm Kevin Ehrman-Solberg, one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice project, and I'm going to be talking about kind of our work and what we're doing with racial covenants and kind of what we've learned so far from our project. But before I get kind of started talking about covenants specifically, I want to share a story, and it's not my story. It's the story of the Simpson family. And in 1909, W.H. Simpson and his wife Daisy purchased a lot in the Prospect Park neighborhood of Minneapolis, and they would be the second black family to move into that neighborhood. After they purchased the lot, but before they could even move, begin construction, right, on their new home, they were confronted by a white mob. They were 100 strong, and the mob's leader told the family in pretty blunt terms that their new neighbors would take any means necessary to secure the Simpsons' removal. Now, this confrontation, which the Minneapolis Tribune called a race war, it failed to terrorize the Simpsons into submission. They actually did continue to live in the Prospect Park neighborhood, but it did mark a profound turning point in the history of the city. So this may or may not be surprising to some of you, but Minneapolis was not always segregated. And when the Simpsons moved into Prospect Park, the city was actually a fairly integrated place. In 1910, so this is a few months after the Simpsons moved in, the area of the city with the highest percentage of black residents is near North Minneapolis, and it's about 15% black. You actually have emerging black communities in places like the South Shores of Lake Harriet, around Lake Nokomis, along West River Parkway by the Mississippi, and sprinkled throughout northeast Minneapolis. Well, by mid-century, the picture looks pretty radically different. Those black families down by Lake Harriet and Lake Nokomis, they're completely gone. In fact, by 1940, there is no census district south of 38th Street that contains multiple black families. Same story along West River Parkway, same story in northeast Minneapolis. Again, by 1940, there is no census district in northeast Minneapolis that contains multiple black families. And for the first time in the city's history, you start to see the emergence of majority-minority neighborhoods. So this is a pretty big change, right? It's happening in a fairly compressed period of time. And a lot of it has to do with how racism and how racist ideologies are being used and deployed in communities. And in the early 20th century, the process that geographers refer to as the racialization of space is really starting to kind of grip and take hold of the United States. And basically the idea is this: the quality of an area, the financial stability of an area, the value of an area is now being linked with the racial category of that area's occupant. Sort of like a new brand, a new way to deploy white supremacy, right? And this idea is embraced by virtually all white people. Real estate agents, the federal government, local government, individual homeowners, bankers, you name it, right? Like they're all kind of picking up on this new idea. And this caused an explosion of new tools and mechanisms that are enforcing segregation across the country. I'm sure some of you have probably heard of redlining before, or real estate steering, or discriminatory lending, right? But actually decades before the federal government began redlining American cities, long before the National Association of Real Estate Boards formally adopted racial steering into its code of ethics, and even before really institutionalized discriminatory lending, racial covenants were already remaking cities across the country. Now, let me explain here. Racial covenants, they are clauses that are inserted into warranty deeds that make it illegal for anybody who isn't white to own or occupy that piece of property. Often just a few lines of text, these restrictions were inserted into warranty deeds across the country. And this is what they sound like. No persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. Neither shall said property be transferred or leased to a colored person. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And these examples that I just read, these aren't from Birmingham, right? These are from right here in Minneapolis and the surrounding suburbs. Now, this language is incredibly racist, right? Shockingly racist even. It's also incredibly powerful. And this has to do with the legal mechanism that gives racial covenants their force. So how a covenant works is it tracks with the land and not the individual owner of a given piece of property. It's kind of a weird idea to wrap your head around, but say, for example, in 1910, I buy a house in South Minneapolis and I throw one of these racial covenants onto it. 10 years later, I sell the house to another white person. 10 years after that, they sell it to another white person. 10 years after that, they sell it to somebody who isn't white. This person, even though I've never met them, they lose the house. The property reverts to me, the initial granting party, the person who first put the covenant into the property record, right? So these are incredibly, incredibly powerful tools because they track with land, not with people. In fact, they're so powerful, it took multiple Supreme Court rulings combined with state and federal legislation to finally make these things illegal. We know racial covenants are incredibly powerful, and the idea, I think, that structural racism is a defining feature of urban America. I mean, this isn't exactly like groundbreaking news, right? But the specifics of racial covenants, so exactly like how many neighborhoods were restricted and which ones weren't. How does this inform the long-term wealth gap between black and white homeowners, right? What parts of the city were restricted? Which parts weren't? What's the total volume of restrictions? These kind of more precision level questions, nobody's ever been able to answer because nobody's ever mapped all of these things before. We simply do not know what the long-term impact of racial covenants is because nobody's ever put them together, at least until now. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice project, and this is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to build the first comprehensive spatial database of racial covenants for any city in the United States. And this is the result of our work so far. So each one of these blue dots denotes an individual piece of property that had one of these racial covenants attached. And while there's, and also I should point out, this is a map that's moving through time. So if you look at the top right, it'll tell you the year, and these are the covenants that existed during that period. So you can kind of see the spread, right, of structural racism in Minneapolis and Hennepin County. But the thing about this map, there's already, right, like a ton of blue on here. If anything, this is grossly underestimating the total amount of restricted land. We're still a work in progress. We've mapped over 15,000 racial covenants. We expect to find at least 15,000 more by the time our project is done. So if you live somewhere in Hennepin County, you don't see a blue dot, right, like on top of your house, like you can't necessarily assume that your area was free from this type of racial restriction. We do know covenants first came to Minneapolis in 1910. By the 1930s, it was standard practice. The majority of new homes constructed after 1930 do contain these racial covenants. They were finally made illegal nationally with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, although there was a separate Minnesota law in the mid-50s that made them illegal here locally a little bit earlier. But for the majority of the 20th century, covenants were utilized in Minneapolis and across the United States, and they were devastatingly effective. So what's happening with this though, right? Like why are racial covenants suddenly becoming implemented at such a wide scale in cities across the United States, right? Well, a lot of it has to do with the emerging real estate industry. Realtors are pretty quick to figure out that they can use racism to sell land, and they immediately start using racism to sell land. This is an example, it's a brochure for an addition in Minneapolis, and right there in the brochure they point out that these new lots, not only are they beautiful, but they're also highly restricted. You can kind of imagine what that means. This advertisement for a different edition, this is in the Lake of the Isles neighborhood, they actually print the language of the covenant right in the newspaper ad. Premises shall at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent. So these real estate developers, they're playing on white people's fears about their property values, and they're quick to exploit this new idea that stability and like good investment in space has a lot to do with the racial category of that neighborhood. And covenants aren't just being used to keep existing neighborhoods white, although that's certainly part of it. They're also being used to ensure that all new development is reserved exclusively for the use of white people. So this is a picture of myself in Minneapolis, kind of right by 60th and Cedar, that was taken in 1938. Each one of these red polygons denotes a racially restricted lot that was restricted prior to this photo being taken. So before roads were extended to this part of the city, before houses started to become built, before the utility lines were set down there, before electricity even existed here, right? The first thing developers are doing is racially restricting land. And this ensures that if anybody wants to move into these nice new neighborhoods on the periphery of Minneapolis, in this case South Minneapolis, you have to be white. It's illegal for you to live here if you're black. And while racial covenants have a lot to do with kind of where people do and do not live in the city, that's just part of the story. It's not just about the segregation of space, it's how racial covenants segregate wealth. And racial covenants, especially when combined with redlining, create a really nasty 1-2 punch. Because you wind up with a situation where large sections of the city, it's illegal for you to live there if you're black. Other large sections of the city, they've been redlined by the federal government. That means there's no bank in the country that's going to give you a conventional mortgage. Really, your only options are either cash in hand or predatory lending like contract or deed. So for a lot of the city, it's legal for you to live there, and for the parts where it is legal for you to live there, you can't get a loan, like what happens, right? Like it's really, really hard to buy a house. And when black families are able to surmount these obstacles, which are pretty severe obstacles, they're often met with white violence. This is what happened in South Minneapolis to the Lee family in 1931. This is a more even extreme example than what happened to the Simpsons. In 1931, Mr. Lee, African-American man, World War I veteran, works in the post office downtown Minneapolis. He finds an area, right, that hasn't been redlined and isn't racially covenanted, kind of this like in-between liminal space in South Minneapolis. And within days of moving in, thousands and thousands of white neighbors surround the home. They vandalized the property. They killed the family's pet, their dog, I believe. And it became violent enough that the children required a police escort just to safely get to kindergarten. Their kindergarten-age daughter, Mary, required the cops to take her to kindergarten because this white mob was that violent, right? And the continued hostility, unsurprisingly, proved way too much for this family. And within 2 years, they'd left the neighborhood. So all of these barriers are in place, and they're all kind of working together to effect the same thing: promote white homeownership, promote equity for white people through homeownership, and kind of deny that same ability to African Americans. And while racial covenants themselves have been illegal now for over 50 years, we're still very, very much living with the longitudinal, long-term effects of these policies. So this map right here, this is using 2010 census data showing where African Americans are living in the city today as a core-plugged map. And each one of those red dots on there, that denotes an individual piece of property that was racially restricted back in the day, right? And as you can see, the areas of the city that are the whitest today were also the areas that were highly restricted in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. In fact, the part that I usually like to point out, if you look at the top left, the whitest part of North Minneapolis today is the one part of North Minneapolis that had a large number of racial covenants placed at it in the century. And it's important to point out, too, that these white neighborhoods, they're also some of the wealthiest parts of the city today, right? If your family was able to buy in down by Lake Nokomis in 1950, which at the time was an affordable neighborhood, like, if you're a middle-class family, you could buy down there, your property values have skyrocketed. Black families, on the other hand, were not able to capture those same long-term financial gains. In fact, black neighborhoods weren't just ignored, they were actively disinvested in. So this map right here shows how freeways specifically were used to facilitate the movement of white people at the expense of African-American neighborhoods. So we're going back to 1940 now. That's what this map is showing, kind of where African-Americans specifically were living mid-century. I just overlaid subsequent freeway projects on top of that map. And as you can see, largest black neighborhood at the time is near North Minneapolis. It was wiped out by the expansion of Olson Memorial through 94 and 94. Same story on the east end of downtown, kind of where the Viking Stadium is today. Same story along Hiawatha in southeast, and same story along 35W. And you might notice, or be familiar with the fact that 35W makes that kind of weird curve before linking up with 94, down there. So in the original planning documents, it's supposed to go straight here. But at the last minute, the planners realized if we go straight, we're going to hit the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and that was considered unacceptable. So they rerouted the freeway about 5 blocks east, right through a black neighborhood. So even though covenants themselves have been illegal now for decades, the segregative patterns that emerge from racial covenants and this huge differentiation in wealth that emerged from racial covenants is still very much with us today. In fact, Minneapolis has some of the worst racial disparities in the United States of America. The housing gap, we're actually number 1. It used to be Milwaukee, but we just beat them out a couple years ago. Yeah, please don't clap. But it's about a 3-to-1 disparity. Over 75% of white families in Minneapolis own their homes. Less than 25% of black families in the city own their homes, and we are the worst in the United States. So the legacies of racial covenants in terms of not only just like segregation, like who gets to live where, but like who gets to accumulate wealth, who has the stability of home ownership, who can kind of facilitate the intergenerational transfer of wealth by building equity is still operating along racial lines. And we're hoping that our work with Mapping Prejudice can kind of explain how some of this happened. There's nothing natural or preordained about residential and racial segregation in Minneapolis. Like, this was deliberately built, it was deliberately constructed, and we can now actually show exactly how that happened. And we hope that this knowledge can arm community members to make restorative justice a more kind of practical thing to do, right? Like, this can help drive forward equity policies. It's hard to fix something, right, if most people in the city don't even believe there was something broken in the first place. Right. And that's the part that we're trying to change with our work with Mapping Prejudice. So thank you for allowing us to be here and allowing me to speak, and I'm going to turn it over to Neeraj.
All right, so thank you, Kevin. I will be your guide for the rest of the evening. So actually, why don't we have the panelists come on up, And you have in your, well, as you came in, hopefully you got a list of the bios, so I'm not going to read them all. But we have Owen, Duckworth, Kirsten Delegard, Elder El-Kati, Makeda, and Councilmember Ellison will be joining us as well. So they have their bios here, a real esteemed panel. Before we start though, let me frame a little bit of what we're going to do because we want to have this as a conversation. So I'm going to try to move us through sort of 3 steps and a very simple sort of what, so what, now what kind of movement. And actually I just wanted to start, before we turn to the panelists, I want to actually engage you all in just sort of in that what phase of the conversation. What were folks' initial reflections, feelings, observations about the facts and ideas that Kevin shared, or that you experienced as you were out and about before we started?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to know, hello everyone, my name is Angela Williams. Just want to know, with this, what do we call it, racial covenants? Is it still good today?
Like if you have the covenant on your thing, no, it is not, you cannot legally enforce it anymore.
Oh, okay, so what happened? How did it?
So it was the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
And that's what broke it down?
And other, I mean, there was state and legislative action too that had to make it,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so, hello, my name is Kirsten Delegard. So there were three big things that happened. One, Shelley versus Kramer, it was a Supreme Court decision that was brought by, the case was brought by the NAACP after decades of litigation by the NAACP. The Supreme Court declared covenants to be unenforceable. That was not enough to stop developers from continuing to use these. So they were still entered into new property developments after that. Here in Minnesota, the state legislature declared them illegal in 1953. But again, I think we have still found some after 1953. It still did not stop developers from putting these into place. Then the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. That made them illegal across the country. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Robin. Something that really came to mind is kind of how these practices reinvent themselves, especially in thinking of, now we have the light rail coming into North Minneapolis, and in thinking of how in contemporary gentrification, white people are actually moving back to the cities, and the rise of, or the ever-increasing cost of living in the metropolitan area is now forcing Black and other POC communities to move out to the suburban areas that were mostly dominated by white folks, and they're fleeing back to the city. So now we have a reverse push out of them now.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes, Cindy, and then I'll go over here.
I'm Cindy. It also made me think about how we always have du jour, like these laws that say you can do it, and then we have this de facto of like, well, we're going to do it, but we're going to call it a different way. So living on the north side for 18 years I held, I would tell friends, oh yeah, you should come move over when they're looking for a house, and they'd say, my realtor won't show me houses over there. And you're like, that's actually illegal. So the map of what the realtors made out there, where it's desirable, we also use that language when we talk about schools. And we have schools of reputation in Minneapolis. And people will send their child to a school without ever walking through the halls because they see white people there.
Tyler.
Hi, Tyler Sitt from New City Church. I'm wondering if we could tell more stories about movement building and power, like what was required on the ground in terms of activism for people to be able to create change within Minneapolis.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mitchell. What struck me was the redlining certainly many of us knew about. Those covenants really didn't know as much about, but this map here with the transportation and the roads, and how vivid that is, just smashing and slicing the I'm just wondering now, because of course we look all around, we've got construction all the time going on. In the new roads, is MnDOT looking at a different approach to have for future development of our transportation expressways? That's a great question.
Kathy.
And I'm Kathy Span. I think that you pointed out that it is intentional. And I do believe that this is all intentional. And I think we need to really hear more about why this existed in the first place. And I think you pointing out that this was really intentionally done, and how things are not by happenstance, but things are done to people of color with intent and with purpose.
Thank you so much. Alexis Penny, I live in the Jordan neighborhood. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone being here and bringing your comments and being willing to share them. Movement making is incredibly important, so I think this conversation is going to stir us up and make us want to say, well, what can we do to get involved to make this not the reality? But I think what Robin's really saying in terms of like new investments that we want to support and see happen in North Minneapolis, it's really it's a challenge really, because like reality, disinvestment being the default for a very long time. Like obviously you don't want to see that, but at the same time, when you have whether that's transportation projects that are coming online, or you have new development that's happening near the riverfront with Upper Harbor Terminal, for example, and having conversation, like really honest conversations about whether or not we have affordable housing be a part of that conversation, and whether or not that affordable housing actually continues to be affordable housing much more longer into the future is another conversation as well. So I just appreciate everybody wanting to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Hi everybody, my name is Owen Pugh, and I am the board chair of Jordan Area Community Council. And I would like to even go a little bit further back than you all went. And if we think about the land in which we sit on and who it belonged to, and how Europeans came in and took the land and took the land and did what they wanted to do with it, because they were being pushed out or didn't want to follow rules and laws where they live. So they came here and took the American Indians' land where they live, called them savages, and then they did all of this, and people of color came not by choice, and we still continue to get pushed out from then to now. So I appreciate this, but it angers me, and that's why I have my voice is shaky, because it angers me being a person of color. But what do we do now? Because the fact of the matter is that decisions are being made, and if we are not voting in the right people, we are not going to see the change that we need to see. And so we need to get more people of color in offices, but then it's hard when they get there, because I'm also in taking a class, I'm in a program called Masters of Advocacy and Political Leadership, and yes, the Mapping program. And what I'm learning is that there are so many players in decision making that it's hard to get bills passed because it's hard to get them in. So then what do? We're back to square one. Every time we take a foot forward, we get 10 steps back, and things are steady moving along, and we're still getting pushed out is the bottom line. And how do we get past that? Because it's still happening, it's gonna continue to happen, because it's less people of color than it is white people for right now, and it's allowed in office. Because they still making deals behind the table who to get in. We just saw that with Kavanaugh. So what are we gonna do about it? And how can we do anything? Because the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Thank you. Other, yeah, go ahead.
I really much agree. My name is Shantae, by the way. I work for Appetite. I really agree with what she said, and about how does this really affect these statements and these covenants and these laws? How do they really affect the future? Because somebody like myself, who I'm getting myself together so I could be a homeowner and have that opportunity for my family, my future, how is this gonna affect my peers? People that are just like me, that are under 30 and understand all of the moving parts in this white supremacist society that we live in. How does that affect us tomorrow and for the next 50 to 100 years? Because we know that it needs to change. We just need to know what we need to do and how to change it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey everybody, my name is Yanika, and I work for Northside Achievement Zone, but I'm also a Lynn Bohannon Humboldt Greenway resident, and I wanted to ask about who are the entities, or who could be or should be holding funders and developers accountable for the unspoken housing covenants now. And I will name Parkway, the homes over on Parkway by the Humboldt Greenway. And I specifically know that the target population was identified as not us. I'll just keep it there. It was not us. It was for these urban, suburban experience for the people who are down by the warehouse and people who are in corporate. And it was made clear to me that it was not for us. It wasn't for the residents or returning residents. It was for people who are not a part of this community.
Other just initial thoughts, feelings, observations?
Just one more. Did anybody need to register to vote?
Okay, so we're gonna pivot to this fine group of folks, and I'm framing my questions to you all sort of in the so what side. So we heard some of the what from audience members, and I'm gonna just tell you the three sort of general questions. I'm not gonna be able to hold you all into this box, so feel free to go where your spirit takes you. But generally, I sort of had this frame. So what does this history, these ideas and facts have to do with where we find ourselves today, just generally, right? And then I would want to go deeper with the second question as it relates to our current housing specific challenges. So that's kind of the first two questions. And then the third question that I want us to dig into in the 30 or 40 minutes that we have just for your all's comments is, so what does this history have to do with the work that each of you are doing, the decisions you're trying to make, how you're trying to make those decisions, we should be accountable to, and some of the ideas that were represented, I think, in these first comments. We know who was harmed, right, through this history, and so how do we ensure who benefits as we think about moving forward? So, and I'm not gonna call on people, so I'm gonna just throw that first question out and anyone can reflect. What does this history have to do with where we find ourselves today?
Can I say something? Well, I always say, or we say as a team, as the Mapping Prejudice team, that we're making a case for reparations. And so that's why we're doing this work, is again to echo what everybody in this room is already saying, that this was intentional. There's nothing accidental about it. And so we're making both providing evidence for redress, and also I think providing a roadmap for political mobilization. And so a lot of people try to press the Mapping Prejudice team on, okay, so what do we do about housing? What specific policies do we need? And we always say, as a team, we're just not the right people to answer that question. In the sense that we're not working specifically in housing policy. We're geographers and historians and activists. But what we do know is that we have to, before we're going to move forward, before we're going to summon the political will that we need to make these changes, people have to, they have to reckon, we have to have a new collective understanding of our past. And I think, I'm preaching to the choir, right, in this room. So I don't think it's not this group that I'm making this call to, but I spend a lot of time doing presentations for white audiences around town where I tell people, look, we have to reckon with racial covenants, we have to reckon with redlining, we have to acknowledge the harm that it does, and we also have to honor the Black spaces that were created in the face of this exclusion. We have to celebrate neighborhoods like this neighborhood, which is a sign of the tenacity and creativity and resilience of the people who live here. And I feel like that's the starting point for these conversations. And a lot of people aren't there yet. I think just seeing some of the conversations around, the 2040 plan, for instance, I think a lot of people are just holding on to this myth of the model metropolis. Like, Minneapolis is so great, why are you complaining? Look at our arts, look at our parks. There's still an unwillingness to grapple with the fact that we're at the bottom, we're at the top in terms of racial disparities, and at the bottom in terms of social welfare. So, yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Before I will say anything, I want your name, sir. I appreciate what you.
Thank you. Yeah, Kevin.
Just Kevin?
Ehrman-Solberg. It's a long one, so.
I'm not going to ask you your phone number.
We'll talk after.
Yeah, but I appreciate the comments, the facts. They mean almost nothing. Facts won't get it. You're up against something more powerful than facts. I'm astounded if you even have the word reparation in your vocabulary. That's a no-no. I've come to the conclusion that the Chinese used to say, one of their proverbs, that half of the solution to any problem is having the correct definition of the problem. We don't have the correct definition of the problem in America. It's a critical problem. It's a problem that faces humanity, not just black people and white people as we know ourselves by this experience. The problem in America and throughout most of the Western world is the doctrine, the ideology of white supremacy. That's what it is. That's the common denominator. That's where everything comes from. So I myself, and I'm a product of the civil rights movement, perhaps like everybody in this room, and that's okay. I don't want to be a part of any program where I'm allowed to talk without putting the doctrine, the ideology of white supremacy on the table. It has to be. That's the no-no. That's the common denominator. That's the source. The greatest problems in the world are around an idea of race, which is a relatively new idea in the human family. It hasn't been around that long. The stuff about being white hasn't been around that long. The stuff about being Negroes hasn't been around that long. Stuff of calling indigenous populations Indians who don't live in India hadn't been around that long. These are all creations of a doctrine, a modern, a new ideology, and Hitler didn't create it alone. He crystallized it. And the American people crystallized it. South Africa crystallized it. Australia crystallized it. And it's semi-crystallized all over the Western world. Yes. The major dynamic has been this myth, powerful myth, called race. I'm not a race, and neither are you. These are modern categories, and they all have to do with what? Power. Raw, naked power. We're close to that hour right now. This is Donald Trump is a natural product of this, and he understands that. It's not a Democrat or Republican. We know that. He doesn't care two sticks of dynamite about the other party. It's exploiting the emotions, the ignorance, the incredible fear which they cannot name of people who call themselves white. That's what's happening. And we're about to come to another civil war. Let me just give one point to make, because it's already coming out. There's a documentary being promoted called Race War. You'll be seeing it. We're almost right there. See, in my view, the Civil War never really ended. The only people who seem to be conscious of that are not all Southerners, but of white supremacists. That's never been accepted. That you could live in a society where people are accepted as human beings because they're human beings. No, there has to be ranks. Let me tell you something else. If I know this, a lot of people know this. I was at the University of Minnesota just this morning, talking about the same thing. I indict the intelligentsia. That's who created it. Not Bubba in Alabama with a rifle across his chest saying how much I hate niggas. He's not the source of that. The intellectuals who created that. Hitler understood that. You understand? The people who promoted Nazi Germany took over that country for 12 brutal years. Germany was the centerpiece of Western civilization. And overnight they became savages because Hitler picked up that myth, put it together, and called it an Aryan nation. You're not even white. So white ain't getting it. You gotta be Aryan. And that's been a myth and been dangling around Europeans. I know.
Well, no, I want to build on.
I'm probably not going to say anything else. Because it's
But I want to just take what you're saying. So if white supremacy is defined as a society organized around the fundamental principle that white people are more valuable and or deserving or superior than others, let's take this as a symptom of white supremacy and reframe the question for others too, to say, so what does this version of white supremacy have to do, what does it mean for where we are today? This symptom of white supremacy, as you think of the covenants themselves, what's their meaning today? What's their impact today? Well, hold on.
Let me say this. I'm at this point. I'm at the radical roots of the question. Radical is not an old word. It really means to just be fundamental. Get through the garbage. Go to the source of the problem. There's never been a Negro problem in America. It's a product of a white problem. There's never been an Indian problem. And we gotta face that. Even black people have a difficult time. I'm around black people all the time. Don't touch that question. Some can't even say white supremacy. I have a lovely friend. She just says supremacy. Because it's so horrific in her mind what that means, white supremacy. It is, as Dr. Einstein said, and his feelings about race, the suppressed literature said, that racism is a white disease. It is aggressive disease.
So I'm going to make some space for others on the panel. Makeda, I'm going to look right at you. I said I won't comment people, but I'm just
Well, so what I thought about, it goes along with that, and one of the symptoms of this right here is that many black children believe that it is their fault, and black families believe that it is their fault, that they do not understand money, or there's just something wrong that they can't build wealth. So that's a symptom, and it's a very painful one.
Do you want to grab a mic? And also, you don't have to talk to me.
Oh, all right. Did you all hear what I said? It's a very, repeat that. Okay.
Say it again.
All right. Well, one of the symptoms is that many black children, black families believe that it is their fault, that there is something wrong with us that has made this situation the way that it is. When we talk about why Plymouth Avenue looks the way that it does, you will have folks that say, well, we don't know how to take care of anything. And so, but then you have folks who have taught us differently, which is the only thing that keeps some sanity and some belief and hope that it is not our fault, and that there is a system that is working against us. And so, to your point, then there are people, when you teach young people like that, you get a Deanna and Roger Cummings who decide to get a building on West Broadway in Emerson and invest in it when nobody else would invest in North Minneapolis. Before the city of Minneapolis started to turn around West Broadway, for those of us who've been here a long time. And before the University of Minnesota decided to invest in North Minneapolis, they believed in North Minneapolis and have been investing and have been building and are still here. What white supremacy does, the other result of it is when Dr. Sam Myers comes to the city of Minneapolis and gives a list of banks that do good work for people of color and poor people in Minneapolis, who we can work with to give loans to make sure that people can move forward. And the city still, it goes with the same people that they've been working with who get D's and F's as far as working well for the community. That's what white supremacy does. Let me add one more. The one more, I'm sorry. The last piece that I want to add is we also have this other beast that's working where we are creating more and more ways for people to become felons. And so if you have your own home, then at least folks can come home and maybe y'all don't have to worry about that, but it's nice for folks to be able to come home to a place. But if you don't own your own home, then that also puts your family in jeopardy when they come home from the other college, as some of us call it. And there are more and more things that become felonies now. And that creates a whole nother system. So for those state attorneys or county attorneys who work on felonizing people in our community, we know that we don't want them back in office.
Okay, can I please comment on that? And just last night, we had a debate across the street with county attorneys Mike Freeman and Mark House. And Mike Freeman, just that, at 16 years old, they're going to start creating whatever it is, this pipeline, you know what I'm saying, prison. And he said that the records will be public. So that means that, summer jobs, whatever, 16-year-olds, and it's directed towards, young black male 16-year-olds, because, white males be like, oh, just, give them a hamburger from Burger King or something, and let him go sit in the corner and he'll be all right. But what I'm saying is, that he talked about that last night, and it kind of disturbed me, and I didn't want to rebel rouse, and I was trying to be respectful, but it hurt me, so bad that he would even say, talk about criminalizing 16-year-olds and then making their records public, and then they can't finish high school, they can't go to college, they can't get a job, they can't even get a summer job, they can't even